The men said a woman could not run a cattle auction. She ran it better than any of them. The auction yard in Prescott, Arizona Territory, had been run by Vernon Alt for 22 years, and when Vernon Alt died in July of 1891, from a heart that stopped one hot afternoon, the way hearts sometimes stop, without warning and without negotiation, the question of who would run the auction yard became the most urgent and most contentious question in Prescott. A question that should have had an obvious answer, and that did not, because the obvious answer was a woman. And obvious answers that are women are, in the estimation of certain men, not answers at all, but inconveniences. Because the auction yard was the economic center of the cattle business in Yavapai County, and the cattle business was the economic center of everything else. The feed stores, the saddleries, the hotels, the saloons, the banks that held the ranchers' notes, all of it orbiting the auction yard the way a town orbits its well. Vernon Alt had one surviving child, a daughter named Thea. She was 28 years old, and she had worked beside her father at the auction yard since she was 12 years old, learning the trade the way a blacksmith's child learns iron. She had learned the cattle business the way children of cattle people learn it, by standing at the rail and watching and listening and absorbing the rhythms of the trade, until the rhythms became instinct. She knew bloodlines the way a minister knows scripture, by heart and by instinct. She knew grades. She knew the difference between a steer that would gain weight on summer grass and a steer that would not, a difference that was visible in the bone structure and the depth of the flank and the way the animal carried itself. Subtle distinctions that separated the ranchers who knew cattle from the ranchers who owned cattle, which were not always the same people. Her father had told her once that a person who can grade cattle by looking at them is worth more than a person who can grade them by reading a book about them, and Thea could grade cattle by looking at them before she could read a book about anything. She knew the auction itself, not just the cattle but the theater of it, the cadence of the bid calling, the reading of the crowd and its moods and its hesitations, the smooth management of the ring, the bookkeeping that followed. She had done the bookkeeping for the last 6 years, sitting at the desk in the small yard office with the ledgers open before her, and a cup of coffee at her elbow, and the sound of the auction coming through the window, because Vernon's eyes had been failing, and because Thea's numbers were always right. And the being always right was a quality that her father had valued, and that the cattlemen of Yavapai County had benefited from, without acknowledging. Because acknowledging that the books were kept by a woman would have required acknowledging that a woman was essential to the operation, and that acknowledgement was more than most of them were prepared to make. It was easier, and it had always been easier, to think of the books as something that happened, rather than something that someone did, and the someone who did them was Thea, and Thea was a woman, and women, in the minds of the cattlemen of Yavapai County, did not do things that mattered to the cattle business, even when they were, demonstrably and consistently, doing exactly those things. When Vernon died, Thea assumed she would run the yard. She assumed it because she was the only person who knew every aspect of the operation. The buying and the selling and the grading and the bookkeeping and the complicated seasonal scheduling and the daily management of the yard hands and the upkeep and maintenance of the pens and the chutes and the loading ramps and the auction ring itself. She assumed it because she was Vernon's daughter and because there was no one else, and because the assumption was based on fact and experience and 16 years of daily work, which are the things assumptions should be based on. The cattlemen of Yavapai County did not share her assumption. The cattlemen of Yavapai County held a meeting at the Prescott Stockmen's Association, a meeting held on a Thursday evening in the back room of the hotel, a meeting to which Thea was not invited, and about which she was not informed until afterward. And the meeting produced a consensus, which was that the auction yard required a man, because the auction business was a man's business. And the reasons it was a man's business were the reasons that all businesses were men's business, which is to say the reasons were circular and self-reinforcing and rested on tradition rather than evidence, and had the structural integrity of a fence built in a circle. It looked solid from any single point, but enclosed nothing. The consensus produced a candidate. His name was Mercer Dodd, a square-jawed man of 45 with a loud voice and polished boots, and he was from Tucson, and he had run a small auction yard there for 2 years. and his qualifications were that he was male and available, and that the cattlemen did not want Thea Alt to do the job she was already doing. Mercer Dodd arrived in Prescott in early August with a new hat and a confident manner, and the particular energy of a man who has been given authority he has not earned, and who intends to exercise it immediately and loudly so that the exercising will create the appearance of competence. Because Mercer Dodd had learned early in his career that confidence, performed vigorously enough, can substitute for ability in the short term, and the short term was where Mercer Dodd lived. Thea did not argue. She did not argue, because arguing with a consensus is like arguing with weather. The weather does not care about your argument, and the consensus does not care about your qualifications. She stepped aside. She stepped aside because fighting a consensus requires allies, and she had none, or thought she had none, and she watched. The first auction under Mercer Dodd was a disaster of the quiet, professional kind. Dodd did not know the local ranchers. He did not know their cattle, their reputations, their credit histories, their feuds, their alliances, or the particular protocol of the Prescott yard, which Vernon had developed over 22 years, and which was different from the Tucson protocol, the way any local system is different from any other local system, because systems are built by people, and people are shaped by place. Dodd called the bids too fast for a crowd that was accustomed to Vernon's measured pace. He mixed up lot numbers twice in the first hour. He graded 3 herds incorrectly, assigning prime grades to cattle that were clearly choice, and choice grades to cattle that were clearly select. Errors that cost the sellers real money, hundreds of dollars across the day's transactions, and cost the buyers trust, and cost Dodd the credibility he had been trying to manufacture through the exercising of authority. The cattlemen noticed. They noticed the way cattle people always notice incompetence, which is quietly, and with the particular patience of people who are accustomed to waiting for rain, and for calves, and for market prices to recover, and for things, generally, to sort themselves out. Because the cattle business is a business of seasons and cycles, and the sorting out always comes. But the sorting out was costing them money, and money is the thing that accelerates patience into action. Nolan Cates was the first to say it publicly. Nolan was 41, a rancher with 400 head of Hereford, on a spread called the Juniper, north of Prescott, in the high grass country below the mountains. A quiet, broad-shouldered man with sun-darkened skin and careful opinions, and hands that were never still, who spoke only when he had something to say, and who had not said anything during the meeting at the Stockmen's Association, because he had not agreed with the consensus, and because disagreeing with a consensus in a room full of men who have already decided is a waste of breath that a working rancher cannot afford. He had kept quiet, and he had kept watching, and what he had watched had confirmed what he had already known, which was that Thea Alt was the only person in the territory who could run that yard properly. "This is not working," Nolan said. He said it to Thea, not to Dodd, and not to the association, because Nolan had watched Thea run the books for 6 years, and had watched her grade cattle with her father, and had watched her manage the yard hands with a competence that was quiet and total, and that he had noticed because Nolan was a man who noticed competence, the way most men noticed beauty, as the thing that mattered most, and that was most often overlooked. "I know it is not working," Thea said. "You should be running this yard. The association does not agree. The association is wrong, and the association is losing money because it is wrong, and money is the only argument the association understands." Thea ran the next auction. She did not ask permission. She did not wait for the association to change its mind. She arrived at the yard at 4 in the morning on auction day, before Dodd, before the yard hands, before anyone, and she opened the gates and lit the lamps, and checked the water troughs in each pen, and reviewed every lot number against the ledger, and walked the chutes to make sure the latches were working, and prepared the ring. And when Dodd arrived, at 6, she was standing at the auctioneer's block with the ledger in her hand, and the morning light coming through the dust behind her, and the expression of a woman who has spent her entire adult life being underestimated, and who has decided, with the finality of a gate closing, that the time for stepping aside has ended and will not come again. "This is my yard," she said. "My father built it. I learned it. I know every rancher, every herd, every bloodline, and every dollar that has passed through this ring for the last 16 years. You are welcome to stay and learn. You are not welcome to run what you do not understand." Dodd looked at her. He looked at the yard hands, who were not looking at him. He looked at the cattlemen, who were beginning to arrive, and who were looking at Thea. He left. He packed his things from the small office he had claimed as his own, and loaded them into his wagon, and left without argument, because the argument had been made by the 3 disastrous auctions he had presided over, and the argument had not been in his favor, and leaving was the only response that did not require him to admit that the argument had been lost before it began. Thea ran the auction. She ran it the way her father had taught her to run it, and the way she had always known it should be run, with the right cadence, and the right grades, and the right knowledge of who was buying, and who was selling, and what the cattle were worth, and what the market would bear. She called the bids with a voice that was clear and steady, and musical in its rhythm, a voice trained by years of listening to her father's cadence, and that carried across the ring without shouting, because the voice of a person who knows what she is talking about does not need to shout. She graded the lots correctly, every one of them, without hesitation and without error. She managed the ring efficiently. She closed the books at the end of the day with every number right, as they had always been right, because Thea Alt's numbers were always right, and had been always right for 6 years running, and would continue to be always right for as long as she held the pen. Nolan Cates stayed for the entire auction. He stayed at the rail from the first lot to the last, leaning on the worn wood with his hat pushed back, watching, with the expression of a man who is witnessing something he has been waiting to witness, and who is satisfied, not because he was right, but because the right thing is happening, and the rightness of it is producing the results that the wrongness had been preventing. After the auction, he found Thea in the yard office, closing the books. He stood in the doorway and he said, "That was the best auction this yard has seen in 5 years." "That was a normal auction," Thea said. "That was what this yard should be, every time. The last 3 were not normal. The last 3 were what happens when you give a job to the wrong person, because the right person is a woman. You are right. I know I am right. Being right has never been the problem. Being heard has been the problem. I hear you." Nolan began bringing his cattle to the Prescott yard exclusively. He had been splitting his herds between Prescott and the yard in Flagstaff, but after Thea took over, he brought everything to Prescott, because the grading was accurate, and the prices were fair, and the books were right, and because Thea Alt ran the best yard in the territory, and Nolan Cates knew quality when he saw it, in cattle and in people. He began staying after the auctions. He began helping with the gates and the chute repairs and the pen maintenance, because the gate on the east chute was heavy and warped, and because helping with the gate was a reason to be near her that did not require explanation. He began bringing coffee in the mornings, good coffee that he brewed at the ranch house and carried in a tin pail, because Thea arrived at 4, and the coffee she made was terrible, which was the only thing she did badly, and the spectacular badness of her coffee was the only vulnerability he had ever observed in her, and the vulnerability made her human in a way that her competence sometimes obscured. Thea noticed. She was not looking for a man. She had not been looking for a man. She had been looking for the right to do her work, and the recognition that her work was worth doing, and those 2 things had occupied all of her attention for a long time. But she noticed Nolan Cates the way a woman notices a man who is paying attention without demanding attention, a man who helps without asking for credit, and who shows up before dawn without being asked to show up, and who drinks terrible coffee without complaint, because the drinking is not about the coffee. They married the following spring at the auction yard, because Thea said that a woman who had fought for the right to stand in that ring should be married in it, and Nolan said that a man who had fallen in love with a woman at a cattle auction should probably be married at one, and that he could not think of a better place to make a promise than a place where promises, in the form of bids, were honored every single day. The minister stood where the auctioneer stood, and the wedding guests sat where the bidders sat, and the ring, which had seen 10,000 transactions over 22 years, saw one more, the most important one, the one that had nothing to do with cattle and everything to do with 2 people who had found in each other the quality that matters most, which is not beauty or charm or position, but the quiet, unshakable competence of a person who knows what she is doing and does it, regardless of who says she cannot.